In this episode, we talk about how a 2-year-old child from Meghalaya reportedly tested positive for polio. We also talk about the massive upgrade that India's weather department is set to receive. But first, we talk about PM Modi's visit to Ukraine. Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, exactly 2.5 years after Russia invaded Ukraine, Narendra Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to visit Ukraine since its independence in 1991. During the visit, Modi offered New Delhi's assistance in any active role that could help end the war. To talk about the significance of this visit and what it signals to India's allies, Indian Express's diplomatic affairs editor Shubhajit Roy joins us. Shubhajit, what do we assess is the reason that the Prime Minister chose to make this visit now?
Well, as you rightly said, this was his first visit, since Ukraine became independent in 91 and India and Ukraine established diplomatic relations in 1992. Well, just to circle back a bit, about 6 weeks ago, on 8th and 9th of July, Prime Minister Modi visited Russia for a bilateral visit where he met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. And that particular visit was seen by many in the West that India was possibly in Russia's corner. That is how Russia also projected it.
And this, one imagines, would have been very concerning for India, which diplomatically has been trying to walk a very tightrope.
Yes. So India has been, since the beginning of the conflict, when it started in February 2022, it had been trying to balance between the two sides. Russia on one side, US-led Western Bloc on the other side, which is obviously backing Ukraine. But the visit, because it took place around the same time as the NATO Leaders Summit to commemorate the 75th anniversary of NATO in Washington, D.C., which was hosted by US President Joe Biden. So the portrayal of that particular visit, the signaling from that visit was that India stands with Russia, while the entire NATO leadership is meeting, all the world leaders who are part of NATO are meeting in the US. And after the Moscow visit, there were expressions of concern that were conveyed by US, by Western partners in Europe, and that sort of set the ball rolling for a visit to Ukraine to blunt this criticism, to counter this criticism that India has a strategic partnership with Russia, has a defense partnership with Russia, but it is not in Russia's corner. It does not condone the actions of Russia when it invaded Ukraine. In fact, that was the basic understanding, basic underlying subtext under which this particular visit was planned and then it was undertaken by Prime Minister Modi.
Right. In fact, one thing that now stands out is what PM Modi and even External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said during the visit, which was that India was never neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yes, the Prime Minister said this in his public remarks to the Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky. And you rightly pointed out that External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also said this about that conversation when he was briefing the media in Kyiv, that India has never been neutral in this conflict. India has been on the side of peace.
हम न्यूट्रल नहीं थे. हम पहले दिन से ही पक्षकार रहे हैं और हमारा पक्ष है शांति का. हम बुद्ध की धरती से आते हैं जहां युद्ध को कोई स्थान नहीं होता है. हम महात्मा गांधी की
So, which is essentially reframing how India has always said that this is not the era of war, no solutions can be found on the battlefield, and that dialogue and diplomacy is the only way forward. So, to sum it up, Prime Minister Modi conveyed the Ukrainian President Zelensky that India would be willing to play a role to put an end to this war, to put an end to this particular conflict. And he also urged Ukrainian president to sit together with Russia for the earliest possible pathway to peace.
And Shubhajit, tell us, what were some of the biggest highlights of this meet? What all did we see take place?
Well, we saw Prime Minister Modi going there after visiting Poland, which has also been traditionally been against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. From there, an overnight train journey he undertook to reach Kyiv. And in Kyiv, he went to a memorial where victims of the Ukraine war, especially children, it was a memorial for these child victims of the war. He placed a toy there as a tribute.
And Shubhajit, this image of him visiting this children's memorial was particularly striking because when he visited Moscow, we saw the bombing of the children's hospital in Kyiv. So talk about just the contrast between these two events.
Well, it actually started from the Moscow visit when just hours before Prime Minister met the Russian president in Moscow, the Russians had attacked a children's hospital in Ukraine and in which children were killed. And at that point of time, he had referenced that particular attack and expressed concern, expressed regret, expressed sort of how it is heartbreaking, how this particular incident has sort of, affected him because children were killed, were casualties in the war. And he connected it to his current visit. And at that point of time, if you remember, the Ukraine president has tweeted about his meeting and embracing Putin, and he had used really strong words to criticize Prime Minister Modi at that point of time for embracing the Russian president at a time when children were being killed. So from those images and from that tweet itself, one could sense the sort of anger and frustration and disappointment that was conveyed by the Ukrainian president. So the Indian Prime Minister took the thread from there and tried to convey this time again when he met the Ukrainian president that, he had expressed those concerns while he was in Moscow, and he was willing to reiterate that and make that gesture that, he and India felt concerned at these child victims of the war. So in a sense that it was a continuation of what started in Moscow, that sort of kicked off the visit in Ukraine and also sort of conveyed the sense that India, as the world's largest democracy, was conveying the concerns to the perpetrator as well as the victim in the same tone and language.
And after the memorial visit, PM Modi sat down with President Zelensky for almost 3 hours. What were the things that were discussed during this time?
So, a conversation, as we know now, was mostly about the war, about the conflict, where the Ukrainian president briefed Prime Minister Modi about the ground situation, about the latest developments, including the victory or push at Kursk. So the Indian Prime Minister conveyed to the Ukrainian president that he had already told the Russian president that this is not the era of war. He had also last month told Putin, when he met him in Moscow, that solutions cannot be found in the battlefield. And then he said that if India can play an active role in this particular process, and personally he himself offered his services, his willingness to mediate or broker a deal between the two sides to put an end to the war that is taking place for the last 2.5 years now.
And we know that India wants to project itself and wants to be the peacemaker. But tell us what President Zelensky said he wanted from India.
So he was coming from a standpoint that he was appealing to world leaders who have a channel of communication with the Russian president and who possibly have some kind of influence with the Russian president to put an end to the war. So he's essentially, India is one of the few countries which has developed a channel of communication with both the Russian president as well as was meeting the Ukrainian president. And the Ukrainian president was telling the Prime Minister that use your influence to tell the Russian president to end the war. So he sort of made appeals to India to stop buying oil from Russia. Also said that, there cannot be a balancing act between US and Russia. And India may possibly also be able to host a peace summit in future. So these were the sort of his asks, because from a point of view of a president leading a country in a wartime, it was asked, from his side to the Indian Prime Minister.
And we understand the message this visit sends to India's Western allies. But what message does it send to Russia, who is an important strategic partner, from whom we receive the majority of our defense supplies and from whom we continue to import discounted crude oil?
Yeah, so India has these two strong pillars of defense and energy as of now with Russia. But it also is mindful of the fact that while it has not explicitly condemned Russia for its actions, it has told Putin that this is not the era of war. It has condemned the Bucha massacre. It has expressed concern at killing of innocent children in the hospital in recent months. It has told the Russians about the respect for territorial integrity and sovereignty and asked it to abide by the UN Charter, which essentially sums up India's position on this particular issue. So from India's perspective, this particular visit was a way of telling Russia that what you are doing is something that India doesn't condone. India doesn't explicitly condemn, but it has made enough statements to tell the world that it is not in Russia's side. It does not approve of Russian actions. So from that perspective, India took that position and tried to convey this as a message to the Russian president.
And now that the visit has concluded, what would you say has been its main outcome?
Well, I think the main outcome, the key takeaway would be that India has, after almost 2.5 years of the war, in fact, exactly 2.5 years into the war, it has tried to insert itself as a possible peacemaker, as a possible mediator in the war which is happening in the heart of Europe. And whether that will be taken forward, in what way, at what point of time, but this is the most categorical and clear expression of interest and willingness from Indian government side that India would like to play a role. And the fact that the Ukrainian president has also asked India to use its influence and host a peace summit, it means there is a willingness from one party in the war, and the other warring party is watching this. So I think from that perspective, India as a possible peacemaker, that role which has been open right now, India has staked a claim to that particular role.
And next we talk about the polio vaccine. Earlier this month, a 2-year-old child from Meghalaya reportedly tested positive for polio, which is a disabling and threatening viral disease that once afflicted millions of people. When we spoke to Indian Express's Anonna Dutt, she told us the reason why this made headlines.
So any case of polio triggers alarm bells not just in the country but at WHO level, because it is one of the only two diseases that we have sort of managed to eradicate. It's still in circulation, the wild polio in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and the vaccine-derived polio in some African countries. But largely across the world, we have managed to completely wipe out polio. And that is the reason any case that we detect, even if it is in the sewage sample, it sort of rings alarm bells everywhere.
But besides being a polio case, the other thing that stood out here was that this was a case of vaccine-derived polio.
You know, the polio vaccine, which is most commonly given, and we would all remember the Do Boon Zindagi Ke campaign. It's an oral polio vaccine which has a weakened form of the virus present in the liquid that is given. The problem with that is that virus can keep multiplying and then become virulent again, then become capable of spreading again. So it can happen in two ways. First way is that it infects, multiple children in a given locality where probably there wasn't sufficient vaccination. And while passing from person to person, it regains its sort of strength to cause the paralytic disease and to spread faster. Or it can happen in one single child who is immunocompromised and the infection can stay in their body. Their body isn't able to clear it, and for years it can keep on replicating and getting stronger within that one child, which is what has happened in the case in Meghalaya.
And Anonna, does this affect India's polio-free status?
So good thing is that it was vaccine-derived polio, because had it been wild polio virus, India would have lost its status as a polio-free country. We were declared polio-free in 2014 after we managed to maintain no polio cases for 3 years. So it's a good thing that this is vaccine-derived and it does not hamper our polio-free status. However, the problem is vaccine-derived polio can also then lead to outbreaks, which is what I said in some African countries we're seeing this.
And for those who might not know, can you talk about just how contagious polio is supposed to be?
So polio is an extremely contagious disease, and even when polio was happening in our country, we wouldn't see like a large scale outbreak like the numbers that we see for, say, COVID-19 is because it doesn't cause disease in everybody. It may infect 200% and then, cause disease in one person. And the disease can lead to paralysis of the limbs and can further lead to stopping of the ability to breathe, which is when people die of polio.
And when we talk about vaccine-derived cases, how common are they supposed to be?
So it is very rare for people to get. So first of all, not all infections from the vaccine can be called vaccine-derived polio. That's because it would happen only once it is strong enough to, cause disease and spread. But people do get it, and the statistics in India stands at about 1 in every 1.5 lakh doses that are given. The children can get polio from the vaccine itself.
And although statistically the odds are very low, are there things that can be done to prevent this from happening?
So, this was an acceptable risk when we had loads of cases of polio and children were dying, and we still have people who have lived on with certain paralysis because of polio. But right now we do not have cases of polio, which is why it makes this problem more stark if we even see, these odd cases of vaccine-derived polio, and especially in countries where, it starts circulating. That's a bigger problem, because now the wild polio is not causing the infections, but something that we've given to prevent the infection is causing the problem. But to, counter this sort of vaccine-derived polio problem, most countries have started switching to inactivated polio vaccine, which is a shot that is given to children along with, the routine childhood immunization. And they don't use the oral polio vaccine, which the children take right now. The difference between the two vaccines is that the inactivated polio vaccine contains a dead virus. So it cannot ever regain the strength to cause disease or infection. So that is where the world is slowly moving. Countries like the United States, Canada, they've already completely moved to inactivated polio vaccine. However, we use a combination of both IPV as well as oral polio vaccine.
And so can't we make that switch from oral to moving completely towards the inactivated polio vaccine?
So there are two reasons. One is simply that giving polio drops is just easy. You do not need to train the staff. It can be done by any official from any department. If you remember when the pulse polio days used to happen, people would give polio drops on the railway stations, bus stops, etc. So it's just very easy to deliver the oral polio vaccine. In the case of IPV, we would need trained staff, people who can give injections. It would happen at a health facility. It can't happen door to door. So it has to happen with the routine immunization. When the children come to get their other shots, they would also receive an IPV. And the second reason is simply cost. OPV is much cheaper than IPV. And so, moving completely to IPV is also a very costly affair, because so in countries that have completely moved to IPV, they give around 3 doses of IPV plus a booster dose. And at the moment in India, we just give 1 dose of IPV to the children when they're getting vaccinated for the other infections, plus the OPV, of course. So that is the reason we haven't been able to move completely to IPV.
And Anonna, considering that we have already eradicated polio in India, what is the reason that we are still running the polio program?
Because unless polio vaccination is maintained at a very high level, the chances of importing polio from neighboring countries such as Pakistan and Afghanistan are very high. Polio vaccine has to be given to a huge proportion of the people to get what we call herd immunity and, prevent infections from spreading in the community. And that is one of the challenges of the inactivated polio vaccine. So when we give oral polio vaccine, because the virus is a weakened form and it can still transmit, it sort of gives immunity around. It actually prevents transmission in a population. However, inactivated polio vaccine prevents infection only to the person who gets it. They can still transmit the infection to the others. So that is one benefit that oral polio vaccine has over IPV. And therefore, again, if we completely switch over to IPV, we have to maintain a very high level of immunization. Otherwise, again, we can have a wild polio outbreak because of infection being imported from neighboring countries.
And in the end, we talk about the India Meteorological Department, or IMD, which is set to get a massive upgrade, with the government soon planning to allocate thousands of crore rupees to it. Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who reported on the story for the paper, tells us that this money will now be used to improve localized forecasts and predict extreme weather events which are increasing due to climate change.
Extreme rainfall, extreme heat events, thunder showers, cloud bursts, they are also triggering big disasters. I mean, the kind that we saw in Kerala last month. Before that, there have been Glof events in Sikkim, Uttarakhand. There have been cases of urban flooding. There have been cases of flash flooding. So these kind of disasters being triggered by these extreme weather events. Now, these two areas, they are the weaknesses in IMD's capability. Also, because of disasters, disasters are not just in terms of loss of life and property, there are a huge economic drain as well, right? And there are causing major disruptions. So if your rail network or your road network gets cut off, then supplies are hampered. There are security implications if these things happen. Say, supposing the chicken's neck is cut off for a few days, and then you have all kinds of problems happening because of this. So reliable weather forecast is becoming much, much more important now than, say, it was 10 years ago.
Now, in order to make better predictions, he says the IMD will increase its network of observation instruments and invest in better computing capabilities.
So all these different layers where you set up the observation network and collect data, the second part is then you have to have the computing power. And then the third power is that whatever the data comes, you have to have the models and the understanding of what this kind of data would lead to in terms of a weather event. Now, all those three things need upgradation, and that's what will happen. Also, what needs a little bit of big breakthrough is required in terms of getting the models right, which are models which are India-specific models, which take into account climate change scenarios, and they take in a lot of data from the Indian region itself. Then, there's a lot that needs to be done on the climate change side separately as well, in terms of research, in terms of assessing climate change impacts over the Indian region itself. Right now, the IPCC reports that are the most reliable information about climate change impacting the Earth, they are mostly global models. They talk about Earth as a whole, what's going to be the impact on the Earth as a whole, but you also need to have impacts over small areas. What kind of impacts would climate change have over India, or whether over Eastern India or over Western India? So for that, lots of studies, lots of research would need to be done, so that we have much more granular information about these things.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargava, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.